Okay, today's agenda is we'll do a review question, question 9, and then we'll develop the narrative leading to a study of classical Greece. Before that, I wanted to note that today's lecture and then next week, 3 lectures will sort of conclude the first part of the term, because then we have the midterm break. So I intend to do a review question each of those lectures. That brings us to 12 review questions from 1 to 12, for which you will be responsible on the midterm test. On the midterm test, which I will put up on UmLearn on the 22nd of February, there will appear 6 questions. Out of the 12 questions, I'll select 6, and you will answer 2. And this is a take-home exam. You'll have a week, the reading week, to do the midterm exam, and you will upload the exam on the I guess it will be the first day, 1st of March. So that's the agenda. So a review question every lecture until our midterm break. As for the reading, somebody asked about the reading. Read up to chapter 17, through chapter 17, which takes you down to the Roman Empire. Are there any questions about this?
I have a question about the first essay. So it says that it's due on March 1st as well. So do you
Yes,
have to upload the test questions and the essays on the March 1st all
yes,
together?
yes.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, I want to do question 9 before we get into the lecture. Greek trade and colonization of the Mediterranean were the product of necessity, or in other words, the Greeks in a way were forced um, to break out of their isolation and to begin to trade and exchange commodities with one another. And indeed, their extension over the Mediterranean and into the Black Sea, the Greek city-states spread all over the Mediterranean, um, likewise was the product of necessity. It wasn't a matter of choice. They had to do this. So that's what the question asks you to explain. And we can begin by noting, of course, there was the ancient Greek Bronze Age civilizations, Minoa and Mycenae, which I covered last time. And we saw that these were essentially kingdoms, little kingdoms, um, but we know what we can say about them is that the religion of the Greeks, so-called Homeric religion, and the language comes from these Minoan and Mycenaean people, that clearly they were the forebears of what became classical Greece. We know that much. But as I explained last time, around 1100 BC, Minoa and Mycenae are no more. They're destroyed, and we get a dark age between 1100 BC and 800 BC. And Greece, we're now talking about Greece proper and also the islands outlying from Greece, all through the sort of Eastern Mediterranean here. Um, uh, this area devolved into small villages, small um, isolated villages. And there was no trade, there were no towns, but these isolated villages. And um, um, but between 800 and 600 BC, this state of isolation was transformed by trade and colonization, and the Greeks spread all over the Mediterranean, and what we can call Greek civilization, classical Greek civilization, emerged. Let me explain. So, to begin with, these isolated villages, um, they were basically agricultural centers, um, small populations. People lived off products that they produced locally: wheat, wine, olives, sheep, and goats. Remarkable because it's the basis of the diet of modern Greeks. There's a continuity here that's fundamental um, in terms of Greek culture, and food is culture, as we know. But also very important is the fact that um, each of these villages were separate from any connection with anywhere else. They developed a fierce sense of their independence, and eventually, many of them turned into city states as the population developed. And this became a fundamental aspect of classical Greek culture, independent city states, because this classical Greek culture never achieved political unity. On the contrary, these were independent city-states, fiercely jealous of their independence, and indeed, they were frequently quarreling and fighting with one another, constant war between these Greek city-states. Now, so the Dark Age is very important because the city-state, which is the fundamental institution of classical Greece, emerges during this period. However, the problem was that, first of all, this was an Iron Age culture, and many of the islands had no iron ore, not to speak of copper or tin. There were no minerals out of which to make tools or weapons. And furthermore, as time wore on, between 1100 and 800, the population grew and grew. And so at a certain point, you have overpopulation sets in. More and more people and the same amount of land. As a result of that, you have a lot of the population is land hungry. They don't have enough land. Indeed, they don't have enough food. And some peasants and aristocrats have a lot of food and a lot of land. And so not only is there population pressure and poverty, but eventually it expresses itself in social conflict. So as a result, two things happen. First of all, in order to acquire metals, or indeed to acquire more food, but also to relieve the population pressure, after 800, and I'm dealing with the period between 800 and 600, commercial life rapidly develops, but also many of the overpopulated places turning into city-states send out colonies. A part of the population is sent out as colonies to create new city-states away from the original city-state in order to relieve the population pressure. And here on this map, this green map, you see the consequence between 800 and 600. You see the purple areas. These are the areas starting from mainland Greece here. The Greeks founded colonies all over the Black Sea. They founded colonies in what is today Libya, but also in Italy, southern Italy, southern France, and even eastern Spain. There were Greek colonies. So that Greece wasn't simply the Greece we know today. Greece was the whole of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Greater Greece included all of these places. Of course, this was not unified in a political sense, as I've explained. But the point is that all of this trade and colonization was forced upon the Greeks because of growing population, poverty, and social conflict. That's the gist of the answer. Okay, so we've dealt with that. Does anybody have any questions about what I've just said?
Yes, I have a quick question, Professor.
Please.
I was just not exactly about the material, but about the questions and the format themselves. For the term test, how are we expected to answer these? Like, would it be almost in
2 or 3
like
pages.
essay format, or would it be just
Yes,
more
just write,
like
you've
paragraph
got a
by
week.
paragraph work?
Write up an essay. What you do is you set down the key points. That's the first thing you do. What are the key points in answering this question? You ask yourself. You set out maybe 8 key points, 8 or 9 key points, and then you write a little 2-page essay, 2 or 3-page essay in order to answer the question. Is that what you wanted to understand?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay. So that's question 9. Now we deal with the narrative, which basically continues what I've just said, because this vast expansion of trade and colonization completely transformed the situation. Because whereas in the Dark Age, the Mediterranean and the Black Seas were sort of these villages, they didn't have any, they didn't go out to the sea. Maybe some of them fished, but there was very little in the way of any kind of long distance trade. Now, in the period of trade and colonization, essentially using galleys, the whole of the Mediterranean and Black Sea are unified from an economic point of view. This becomes a market, unified economic entity, and also it unifies the Greeks culturally as well, because they're all of these city-states, emerging city-states, are dealing with one another. Sometimes the relationships are unfriendly, but nevertheless, overall, there's a kind of unity that develops as a result. And I would say that this trade and commerce were the basis of sort of a cultural unification. Now, very important to this cultural unity was the memory of the period before the Dark Ages. That is to say, I told you that the mythology of the Greeks, the religion of the Greeks, the language of the Greeks, all came from the Aegean period. And this was remembered. This was remembered. And so what we call the Homeric religion, the Trojan Wars, Greek mythology, was shared by all of these city-states. They all remembered. They spoke a common language. They remembered the Trojan Wars. All of this was recited in poetry and so on. They knew about Zeus, Aphrodite, the goddess of love, all of the gods, or many of them, were all known. And so they were politically disunited, but they had a common culture. And this was reinforced over time. For example, in the 8th century, in a very interesting development, the Greeks decided to have the Olympic Games were invented by the Greeks in the 8th century. That is to say, every 4 years or so, each city would send its heroes, its athletes, to compete in the Olympic Games. Just as a way, and there would be cultural events and so on. And this was a way of remembering the unity of the Greeks, the Olympic Games in the 8th century. And then as time wore on, also another institution that developed, which had a certain importance, was the institution. Let me see if I can. Yes, the so-called oracles at Delphi. I've already mentioned here um, the religion which was embodied in the books of Homer, the Greek poet of the 8th century, the Iliad and the Odyssey, but also the oracles of Delphi. On the Greek mainland, there was a certain temple, and people would come from all over Greece, across the waters, to have their fortunes told by the oracles at Delphi. And furthermore, over time, in terms of other unifying religious practices, the Greeks developed what we call mystery religions. The two main ones was the mystery religion of Orpheus and Ulysses, sorry, the Eleusis mystery and the Orphic mystery. So we have the religion of Homer, the religion and literature of Homer. We have the oracles of Delphi, and we have the mystery religions. The mystery religions, well, they're a mystery. They were secret. People visited them, and they would become initiated into this secret religion. You would, there were rituals of purification, all kinds of magical rituals which would perfect your soul and so on. So I would say that I'm just indicating some of the main institutions of this politically divided culture. The Homeric epochs or poetry, which were both pieces of literature and religion, the oracle at Delphi, and the so-called mystery religions. A fundamental characteristics of the Greeks was that they were very ethnocentric. They thought that they were the best people. The Greeks were civilized, and everybody else was a barbarian. They considered their culture the only culture, and everybody else was a barbarian. The term barbarian comes from barbar, or sort of everybody else spoke barbar. They didn't speak Greek. And so the rest of the peoples surrounding the Phoenicians, people from Italy, the Romans, everybody else was a barbarian, so far as the Greek. They were very ethnocentric. But I would note as well that the Hebrews thought that because they had the covenant, they said that they were the chosen people. They were also very ethnocentric. In fact, ethnocentrism is a common characteristic. Most people think that their group is the best group. It continues even today, even in little old Winnipeg. The various ethnic groups, they think they're tops. This is a very common human characteristic. Well, the Greeks and the Hebrews, this is the way they regarded other people. Now, that being the case, so I've given, they had this common language, common religion, the Olympic Games, mystery religions, the oracles, the Homeric poetry. These are the things that held the Greeks together. Now, I've already mentioned this. Because they were politically divided to begin with, they quarreled. And one of the characteristics of Greek civilization in this period, right down to its collapse, was these people were constantly at war with one another. warfare was fundamental to the way of life. No wonder they needed iron weapons, because there was constant fighting between these different city-states. A lot of it had to do with commercial rivalry as time went on. But it's estimated that the ordinary Greek city-state would be at war 3 years out of 4. 75% of the time, these states would be in a state of war with another state or other states. So warfare was endemic. And because it was endemic, of course, there was a lot of destruction, killing, but also enslavement, slavery, because many of the people captured in war by the victors in these struggles were sold into the slave markets. And gradually, slavery became, war continued, and slavery became more and more important. So we have this paradox, this fantastic culture. These people are supposedly the inventors of democracy. They create standards of beauty, standards of philosophy, but on the other hand, you have war as a constant, and you have the development of slavery. Are going to have a lot to say about this. In other words, war was institutionalized in Greek society because, in the first place, commercial rivalry. But then the main Greek city-states became dependent on fresh inputs of slaves to run their economy, to work on the farms, or to build stuff. And so slavery became an increasingly important institution. And therefore, sort of war and military expansion became built into the society, negative features. Now I would point out to you, and I'm going to have a parenthesis here because I think it's important to do so. We have in our contemporary world another example of that in the form of the United States of America, which was founded in war and expanded in war right across the continent. Wars against the indigenous people, wars against the Mexicans, wars against the British, and then following the conquest by a continuous series of wars institutionalized in American history. And when that was finished, when the frontier was over, they started to, from 1890 on, they seized the Hawaiian Islands and Guam, and they began to expand into the Caribbean and into the Pacific, and it went on. And they became, following World War II, a world empire based on militarism, based on military, 900 military bases. So I'm saying warfare is institutionalized in this very important modern state. Well, the same thing is true of Greece. The same thing is true of the case of Greece. Now, the next thing I want to do in this lecture is, because it's interesting and it's a way of deepening our understanding of Greek culture, is to consider Greek religion as against the religion of the Hebrews. We've already dealt with the Hebrews and their monotheism. I want to now compare the Hebrew approach to religion to the Greek approach to religion. Well, I would say in the first place, the Hebrew religion turned into a temple religion, and Greek religion was certainly based on the temple. Every city-state had its temple. And likewise, the Hebrews, or the Jews, let's call them, they had their temple. So both of these cultures were based on a kind of temple religion, that's true. But the Greeks were, they believed in many gods. They were polytheistic. Every city-state had its own god, more or less. There was some repetition, of course, but basically these people were polytheists, whereas the Jews came to believe in a single God. They were, as we call them, monotheists. So that was the basic and fundamental difference. But this difference expressed itself in the fact that the Jews considered their God, there was a single God, and he was invisible. He could not be seen. In fact, the Hebrews or the Jews considered it a great sin to make any kind of image of God. This was absolutely forbidden. It was an insult to God because he was beyond human comprehension. And out of respect, you didn't create any kind of statue. Whereas the Greeks, everywhere there were statues of the gods. Every temple had one or several statues to the gods. They created all kinds of representations of these gods. We call this kind of religion anthropomorphic. That is, anthropomorphic means human form. In other words, they gave their divinities human form, in the form of statues. So it was anthropomorphic. And in fact, their concept of these gods, of which there were scores, was these gods, they are oversized or gigantic. They live in somewhere in the heavens above. They sometimes come down to earth. They're human. They intervene from heaven. They directly intervene from heaven, and they intervene into human affairs. Whereas the Jewish God is above all this. He secretly controls everything behind. It's the invisible hand, but he doesn't show himself. Whereas the Greek gods directly intervene. And furthermore, it was conceivable in Greek culture for some great hero, if somebody was outstanding in war, especially in war, a great hero who, say, died in battle, well, the Greeks would say that this hero has become a god. He may not be as powerful as Zeus, but he's a godlike creature. And that's very suggestive, because we know, of course, that for the Jews, this was inconceivable that such a thing could happen, that somebody could join Jehovah as a god. But amongst the Greeks, this was possible. So that when Christianity developed, especially as it developed in the Greek world, this idea of the Messiah ascending as a kind of co-equal with God was not unfamiliar to the Greeks, is what I'm saying. I'll leave it at there. Now, I should say one further thing. I said that the Greek, now I'm turning directly back to the Greeks, all of the Greek city-states had their temple or several temples in which the main god of the city we know most about is Athens, and the god of the Athenians was Aphrodite, Athena, the goddess of reason. But there were several other temples. For the Greeks, the citizens of these city-states, attendance at the temple, practicing the civic religion, practicing the festivals of the god was an important token of citizenship. The local religion, the temple religion, was part of civic patriotism, I'm saying. And this is important in terms of the essays you're going to be writing, in terms of understanding the context in which Socrates was operating, understanding the civic religion of a place like Athens. Now, I want to now talk about the political evolution of the Greek cities. Of course, focusing in the first instance on Athens. Athens is, when we deal with classical Greek culture, Athens is always put at the top because from a political point of view, from a cultural point of view, from an economic point of view, Athens, which at its height had a population of between 500,000 and 600,000 people. It's the largest and most powerful city in the Greek world, and so naturally we know most about it. They left most of the records. So in any case, back to the Dark Ages. Well, the Dark Ages political life was primitive. There were these villages, and there would be a little king, a kinglet. There was a king at the head of many of these city-states. That's for the Dark Ages between 1100 and 800. And then during the period of colonization and trade, 800 to 600, we call this the period of aristocratic rule. I noted here, aristocracy is dominant. There is a landed elite, landlords collecting rent from peasants who also have a military monopoly. They are overwhelmed. The ordinary peasants, they don't participate very much in the warfare. And so the aristocrats rule. This is a period between 800 and 600 BC, dominated by the aristocracy. However, toward the end of this period, the problem of overpopulation, it doesn't go away. Despite the development of trade and commerce, the population keeps growing, more and more people on fixed amount of land, and therefore poverty, growing debt amongst the common people who have to take loans from the aristocrats, and sure enough, social conflict between the aristocrats and the peasants become endemic as the period of colonization aristocrats wears on. And so in response to these contradictions, to these problems, we have the development of this, we can call it 2 centuries in which the aristocracy no longer dominates, but we have a series of tyrants. The 7th and 6th century BC is the period of tyranny. So let me review the politics. The Dark Ages, 1100 to 800, aristocracy between 800 and 600, and then from 600 to about, from 700 down to 500, this is the period of the tyrants. Tyrants from 700 to 500. And who are the tyrants? Tyrants are strong men in a context of growing class conflict between peasants and aristocrats. The conflicts become so bad in these city-states that a strong man emerges who basically takes absolute power over the city, and basically he's a dictator, and he controls the politics. No other politics are, it's a dictatorship. No other politics. It's a way of controlling the class struggle. And we see, to make this more vivid, we see that even in the United States, which has been a republic for a very long time, a Republican democracy, we see the emergence of a character like Trump in a context of vast social inequality and incipient class war in the United States. That's the reality. And so Trump emerges as a guy who's going to solve all the problems. And he makes a bid for power. He's suspected of wanting, and I think with justice, he's suspected of basically wanting to establish some sort of tyranny, some sort of dictatorship. But what I'm trying to get at is that this kind of politics of dictatorship or tyranny, it flourishes, it grows in periods of great social inequality and incipient social conflict. And so this is what happened to Greece between 700 and 500 BC. Any questions about what I've just said? Now, Athens is a very good example of these processes, particularly because we know a lot about it, and it all ended up in a democracy. We'll see how that worked. So let me take the case of example in terms of the evolution of Athenian society between the 6th and the beginning of the 5th century BC. Now, Athens, and I think I need to bring up a map. Just hold on, bear with me. Take a break or something. Okay, here's a picture of Athens. Okay, Athens, by the end of the 6th century, you have 500,000 people living in Athens. And the thing is that Athens is one of the few places in Greece. Greece is, there's little agricultural land in Greece. It doesn't have, it's not like Manitoba or a place like that. No, there are valleys and hillsides where people practice agriculture. But Athens happens to be in a relatively, for Greece, a relatively large agricultural plain. And therefore, there was large peasantry, relatively large numbers of peasants who grew grain and made it possible, because of the surpluses, to feed a growing population. So therefore, Athens was a big city. Furthermore, Athens began early. It became the leading commercial center in Greece. And its commercial prosperity was based on three things. First of all, they manufactured a pottery, and pottery was the way people carried things around. Some of these pots were enormously large, and the Athenians became specialists. These pots were extremely well made and beautifully decorated in the pottery workshops by craftsmen. And so they, all over the Greek world, this Athenian pottery was valued, and so they sold lots of these pots. So that was a big commercial industry. Furthermore, many of these pots were filled with olive oil. On the marginal land that wasn't good for growing wheat, the Athenians planted thousands and thousands of olive trees, and their olive oil was the best in Greece. So lots of these pots were exported filled with olive oil. So that became a second big specialty for the Greeks. Finally, on the soil outside of Athens, big silver mines were discovered, and as many as 30,000 slaves worked producing silver, which was the basic currency in the Greek world. So the combination of pottery, olive oil, and silver, plus eventually thousands of craftsmen manufacturing other things, Athens became this, for the Greek world, an enormous city. As a result, great prosperity. And the city, for one thing, the landlords who dominated the countryside, they lived, because Athens was attractive and not far, they lived in Athens. But also there were many merchants, craftsmen, slaves, hundreds of thousands of slaves in Athens. While the peasants lived in the countryside, there was this very diverse population. Furthermore, many of the people who were living there in Athens by the 6th, 5th century were foreigners attracted by the wealth, the cosmopolitan of Athens. Tens of thousands of foreigners moved to Athens. So it was a real metropolis, was Athens. But the reality was political life was still dominated by the aristocrats. And there was terrible class conflict going on between the peasants and the landlords, but also the craftsmen, of which there were tens and tens of thousands. They also began to demand economic rights and political rights. And so the aristocrats were faced with the opposition of the peasants and the craftsmen. And so we see that starting in the 7th century and continuing, a series of tyrants take power. But what's notable is that at the beginning of the 6th century, there is a tyrant who seizes power. His name is Solon, spelled S-O-L-O-N, Solon. And he turns into a reformer. Instead of abusing power, as most tyrants do, no. Solon was a man of virtue, and he was in power only a few years during the 590s, the first decade of the 6th century BC. But he instituted a land reform. He gave land to the peasants to assuage them, to mollify them. And also he canceled their debts. Many of them had fallen into debt. He canceled the debt. And for good measure, when the citizens said, well, stay, remain our ruler for the rest of your life, Solon said, nothing to it. I don't believe in tyranny. I'm stepping down. So he's considered a great hero in Athenian history. Well, he steps down, but other tyrants take his place for a while. But finally, in 510, the Athenians chase out the last tyrants and they establish political democracy in Athens. It's the first state to become a democracy. But many of the other commercially advanced states in Greece by this time follow the lead of Athens, and the age of democratic government begins. Will continue. This is the great age of Greece. Will continue on Monday. Have a nice weekend.